Yes, friends, listen to that thunder and lightning crash outside. The thunder crashes for an especial reason tonight. For tonight, friends, we will hear true, scary storm stories. Verified true events that took place during a storm. I don't think there are two combinations that really go so well together as these, least of all with true scary stories. Without further ado, friends, I present to you our first story, The Man in the Storm, by Unknown and Alone. This happened a couple of years ago, and is about the only really creepy encounter I've had in my life. Hope this is the right place for a story like this. I am a single mother, and I live in a fairly large city in the Midwest, just me and my toddler. It was winter when this happened, and there was a pretty fierce snowstorm blowing outside. I am a smoker, so I still have to go outside and deal with the wind pelting my face with snow as I feed my final craving of the night before heading to bed. My porch is covered and has 3 trees in front of it, so it's really hard to see in at night, and I never turn my porch light on when I go out to smoke. It was late, 11 or 12, and the street was deserted. Although I live in a big city, my neighborhood is really quiet at night, and my street dead ends at a park, so there isn't much traffic. As soon as I stepped outside, I could hear something in the distance. I sparked up my cig as always and looked down the street to where the noise was coming from. It sounded like an animal growling. As the sound got closer, but was still a block away, I could see a man walking. He was all in black, hood up, and I couldn't make anything out beside this. He was speaking in a deep, guttural growl. It was the most demonic thing I'd ever heard. It honestly did not sound human, but I know crazy can make people inhuman. It's hard for me to describe just how fear-invoking this voice was, but I also have a curious nature, so I stood frozen in the storm like a deer in the headlights, watching and listening. I can't really remember most of what he said, but I do remember the phrase, "This is the book of the dead." He was walking on the opposite side of the road as my house, and had made it to about half a block away. I hadn't moved from directly in front of my door, holding my phone with a death grip in my pocket, and I was smoking my cigarette as quickly as possible to get back inside. He was approaching the intersection right before my dead-end street, and I figured he would turn. I hoped he would turn. He didn't. He kept walking toward the dead end, still speaking in this deranged voice, incoherently, something about this book of the dead. At this point, there were a million things racing through my mind. He couldn't see me. He was just some random crazy. Even though he was just about right across from my house, I still couldn't make out any details of his face, or really see anything behind his black hood. Suddenly, he stopped talking, stopped walking, and his hood slowly turned in my direction. I dropped my cig, rushed into my house and locked the door, looking out of the window to see what he did. He stood there for probably 30 seconds, and then started walking again. He crossed the street and stopped again, directly in front of the sidewalk from my door to the street. He stood facing my house for 3 or 4 minutes. I stood behind my locked door, staring at him as he stared back at me. Although he was about 20 feet from me, his hood still concealed his face. I was debating internally if I should call the cops, the phone still clutched in my hand, but he honestly wasn't breaking the lawn anyway. He was just standing on the sidewalk, looking at my house. The standoff felt like it lasted an hour, with my heart leaping out of my chest. He was silent as he stood, and the only thing I could hear was the wind and pellets of snow tapping my windows. He turned and started walking again, speaking out in his growl. He kept on walking down the dead end and into the park. I could faintly hear his demonic voice through the door as he walked, and that was it. He was gone. I checked on my son, and he was sleeping soundly, thankfully, although I can't say I did the same night. Yes, friends, you see what I mean about the perfection of the two subjects intertwining: true scary encounters and storms. We will hear from a bevy of storms tonight, both winter and otherwise, as is the case with our next story, Man in the Forest, by Gideon Godwit. For reference, I am a female in my late 20s, and about a week ago, I had an unsettling encounter. The city I live in is surrounded by reserved land set aside by the city planners, which is a forest of pine trees, a greenbelt it's sometimes called. I usually walk my dogs in the area closest to me, which is about a 10-minute walk from the middle of the town. It's one of my favorite places to go, but now I'm nervous about going into the area alone. The city is usually very safe, and I have never had any concerns out by myself, even in the dark, and I've been in the forest when it's dark many times with no incident. The track where I access the forest is at the top of a dead-end street, through a park with a playground, and up a long series of steps. It's quite secluded. I have 2 dogs, an older one and a 1-year-old. They're a working breed, huskies, and very high energy, though the older one is now arthritic and doesn't need much exercise, but the younger one needs a huge amount of off-leash exercise daily, which is why I was out on this particular evening. The older dog is also very shy and has a nervous disposition. It was after work in winter, so the sun had just gone down. It was also bad weather, nearly a storm and raining, although the trees sheltered you from most of the rain. I got into the forest and let my dogs off leash. We met a couple of other people, also with high-energy dogs along the way. As I was walking along one of the tracks, my dogs were up ahead of me, running up and down the banks at the sides of the track, and I noticed up ahead there was a man sitting on a seat. I could see he was dressed in dark blue track pants and a leather jacket over a hooded jersey, head down staring at the ground. His hood was up, and I couldn't see his face. He was just sitting there in the rain, and I immediately got bad vibes from him. I tried to shake them off as just someone out for a walk, but decided to stay alert just in case. A few minutes later, the older dog looked back at something behind me, and then jolted, clearly spooked, running in the direction of the playground. I'd never seen her run away like that before, and the younger dog ran after her. I yelled for her to come back, but she was gone. The younger one came back after a while when I called, but kept running up ahead and back, like he couldn't decide who to go with. That's when I decided to look behind me, and saw the man a little bit further behind me. I started to get really nervous about the man, but more about my dog who had run away. The track I was on makes a large loop before heading back to the playground, but the track below led straight back, so I quickly climbed down the bank onto the lower track and started hurrying along after my dog, not running because I have a ruined back, but walking as fast as I could. The track was muddy and slippery now, so it was an unfortunate slow going. By this time, it had gotten pretty dark. When I got near the steps, I saw both dogs sitting there, and they came running up to me very excited to see me. Relieved, I turned around, and the man was right behind me. He had to have run down or followed me down the bank to get there that quickly. I realized that I really needed to get back to a populated area, and I headed back down the steps as fast as my back would let me. When I got back to the bottom of the steps, I put my dogs back on the leash. The younger dog started growling for the first time in his life, and I glanced back. The man was halfway down the steps, and when he saw me, he suddenly stopped and proceeded to tie his shoelaces. I kept looking at him with my dog still growling. He shot me a long, angry look, and then turned around and walked back up the steps into the darkness of the forest. Nothing bad actually happened, but it really got my adrenaline pumping, and I can only guess what might have happened if I didn't have dogs with me. At least the younger one, because the older one was absolutely useless in a protection capacity.
Man Up from My Creepy Neighbor by Young Fizzy.
So I live in an urban neighborhood surrounded by a very affluent city. Many of the people who lived in my neighborhood were either big business workers, engineers, or medical professionals. I was about 15 at the time the craziness started happening, and my younger brother was in middle school. I lived on a small cul-de-sac with other families who have kids around my age. Directly across the street lived a man. Let's call him Bass for the sake of privacy. His wife and young daughter. Bass was an engineer for a local company and was very friendly for the first year he lived across from us. We invited him and his family to our cookouts and neighborhood gatherings because at the time he seemed like a normal guy. Well, here is when it all started to go down south. Somewhere along the line, people on our circle began to see strange things happening at Baz's house. The lawn was never cut, the pool was never cleaned, and we haven't seen his wife or daughter leave the house for quite a while. We would see Bass drive off in his sports car, but his family was never with him. It turned out Bass had some sort of mental break and threatened his wife with a gun while he was intoxicated, saying that he was going to hurt himself. His wife and daughter were understandably traumatized and immediately got the hell out of there. During a freezing winter night, I woke up to the sounds of police cars, fire trucks, and ambulances. Considering I live in a small neighborhood, I rarely see emergency vehicles in our area. Maybe the occasional cop for a noise complaint, but that's it. It was probably around 2 a.m, so I groggily went to my window to see what was going on. My heart immediately sank. Bass, our neighbor, had gotten drunk again purposefully and buried himself in a snowbank naked and was refusing help from the authorities. We all felt terrible for Bass because he was such a nice man otherwise when we met him, but somewhere along the way he just snapped. Fast forward to that following summer. Bass's drinking problem had gotten way out of hand to a point where he lost his job and his license due to multiple DUIs. I was home alone, babysitting my brother and next-door neighbor because both our parents worked, and my brother was good friends with the neighbor kid. A cop pulled up to our house around lunchtime saying that Bass had taken a car, drove it around our neighborhood at alarmingly fast speeds, and was possibly armed because he was arrested for owning an unregistered weapon prior. Apparently, he heard the cops were coming because many neighbors complained. He had ditched the car and was last seen wandering through the woods behind my house, by the people who lived down the road from us. You know that feeling when you reach in your pocket to find something and it's not there? That stomach-dropping sensation? I had that times 1,000. The cops said that if I saw him go back to his house, to call them immediately, as they had no idea where he had wandered off to now. After the cop left, I went into panic mode. I locked all the windows and doors and informed my brother and the neighbor to call the parents and tell them the situation, since they were all still at work. An hour passed, and my brother and my neighbor were just sitting in the living room watching TV, and I was at the dining room in the front of the house keeping watch. I noticed some of the trees in our yard were moving, as if someone was trying to push through them. I informed my brother and neighbor to get out of sight of the front windows and to stay quiet. As soon as I said that, I saw Bass stick his head out of the trees, spot me in the window, and run back into the woods. I immediately called the police, freaking out, saying that he was still in the woods hiding, and saw that I was home. Bass knew what my parents' car looked like, and since they weren't in the driveway, I was sure he knew I was home alone. I was relieved when he was back in the woods, but at the same time not knowing exactly where he was freaked me out even more. For the hour following the call to the cops, no sign of Bass, until he appeared in my backyard, walking out of the woods. I was freaking out because the only thing keeping me from the outside was a sliding glass door. I was in the kitchen and ducked behind a countertop. I peeked my head up and saw that he was looking at my door from about 20 feet back, just staring and not moving. After about 20 minutes, he ran to the front yard, and that's when I noticed he had something in his pocket. I was not exactly sure what it was exactly, but he kept his hand close to it while going to the road and locking himself back in his garage. Finally, the cops came, but since he was back on his property and had no evidence other than the neighbor's account of him driving through the neighborhood, they really couldn't do anything except give him a warning. Basically, it was our word against his at that point. Years went on, and he just made the dive into a complete psycho, locking himself in the garage and his door running the exhaust. He stocked up large propane tanks and planned to light a match, completely blowing the place up. Luckily, his next-door neighbors smelled the gas and called the police and the fire department immediately. It went into full hazmat suits to retrieve him from his garage. The final straw was when I woke up again in the middle of the night to him moaning. It sounded so close to me, I thought someone was in the house. At first I screamed, hoping my parents would run in and beat up whoever was in the house. But as they burst into my room, they realized it wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from the outside. I slowly peeked through my blinds to see Bass lying on the road in front of our house, just groaning and singing, but it was all incoherent. My dad stormed out of the house while I was screaming to him, telling him to come back. He told Bass that he better get back home or we would have to call the police again. Of course, Bass got confrontational and threatened my father, telling him that he should watch out. He proceeded just to go back to the middle of the road and lay down, but in silence. My dad had enough, so he came in and slammed the door and locked it and told me to go to bed. I didn't get any sleep during that night. That junior year, he ended up just randomly disappearing. Some people said he got put into a mental hospital. Some said he finally got put in jail for a long time. And then there was the idea that his mother came back and took him out of state. The house is still empty to this day, and I still live in the same house. Disturbed Footsteps in the Snow by Saphra Wright 2. This happened to me last winter during the first few snowstorms. I'm a student in a university town, and I was living off campus at the time with my roommate in a 2-apartment house. A few weeks prior to this in the fall, my roommate and a friend had taken an questionable substance at our place, and I was babysitting them. In the course of their trip, one of them had pulled the door handle off of the front door. This is important later. Since they were basically on another plane of existence, the door handles were tricky to figure out. Fast forward a few weeks. It was early in winter, and our door still hadn't been fixed. We had gotten into the habit of just leaving it unlocked, so you would only have to push on the door for it to swing open, as there was no handle, and was tricky to open from the inside when it was closed. Nothing to pull on. Now, we were still able to deadbolt it at night, but being a small town, we usually left it unlocked during the day, even if neither of us were there. Stupid, I know, but it was a decent community. So, one evening, I had gone to bed around 11 p.m., and I think my roommate probably headed to bed shortly after. Usually I was the one who locked the door at night out of habit, but tonight I had gone to bed a bit early and assumed my roommate would take care of it. Wasn't a big worry. I woke up around 8 a.m. the next morning, and being a smoker, the first thing I did was step out to have a quick smoke before showering. We had a small porch outside the front door, so I threw on my coat and stepped out to light up. I was just flicking the lighter when I noticed that there were footsteps in the snow on the porch, where a light snow had fallen during the night. The tracks led from the end of our driveway up to our door, then over in front of the living room window to the left, then back to the door. At this point, I was freaking out because the door had been unlocked all night, and you only had to push on it to get in, and these tracks led straight to our front door. My first thought was that perhaps my roommate had a visitor overnight, but I quickly dismissed this idea. I then panicked and quietly went back inside in case whoever this was had entered the house and was still inside. No one was there, fortunately, so I went back to examine the footsteps. A closer look revealed after they went up to our door, they turned around right off the porch, walking closely along the side of the house where my bedroom window was, and it looked as though they had stopped there briefly before moving on. This is where it got really weird. I continued following the tracks, trying to figure out what the hell the person was doing at our apartment in the middle of the night. They turned a sharp right, still hugging to the side of our house and along the wall where my roommate's bedroom window was, and carried on past the other apartment in the building. At this point, there was a small paved road gap between our building and the next of the three on this street. It was like a slightly larger alleyway-sized space. I'd like to point out that as these tracks crossed the neighbor's lawn, it seemed like they couldn't decide to keep going to the next house or back to the sidewalk as they weaved back and forth. These tracks led across the gap and up to the corner of the next house and stopped directly in front of a gutter drain pipe down the side of the house. The footsteps shuffled here on the spot or stood in front of the gutter for a while and then continued around the corner of the front of the next apartment, across their lawn, and then quickly turned down the side of their building. This was an even smaller path, which led to a wooden door leading to their back garden, which was completely fenced in. These footprints paced up and down the side of the house in what looked like many times, before going into their closed-off backyard. This apartment happened to be abandoned at the time, big for rent sign in the window, so as far as I knew, no one lived there. Having gone as far as I could, I went to see what the hell these tracks had come from. They had to come from a long dirt path directly to our place. This was a dirt path you could only get along if you were going somewhere in a small suburb. To walk down there directly to our place, you must know where you're going, as it's quite out of the way. I was pretty freaked out, as I didn't know if they had entered our apartment in the night, and judging from their path, they seemed disturbed. I told my roommate when he got up, but he didn't seem to freak out about it, and even suggested it was the meter reader. I had thought that as well, except our electric box was on the completely other side of the house, and no tracks led there. I still have no idea what this guy was up to, but it still creeps me out to this day, mostly because I've been racking my brain trying to figure out what was going on, as I was probably the only one who seemed concerned about a possible creeper in our house, with the exception of my friend Megan, who was also thoroughly freaked out. Needless to say, I will always make sure the door is locked after that.